When the lawyer slid a check for exactly $1 across the mahogany table, Valerie's bitter laugh echoed through the breathless room. It was the ultimate insult from a family that despised her. But she didn't know that single crumpled bill was the key to a $50 million hidden empire. The rain in Providence, Rhode Island, was relentless, mirroring the dreary rhythm of Valerie Simmons' life. At 34, she was a divorced mother, working double shifts at a diner, just to keep the heat on in her cramped two-bedroom apartment. Her ex-husband, Derek, had vanished 3 years ago, leaving her with a mountain of credit card debt from his failed startup and entirely abandoning his financial responsibilities toward their 8-year-old son, Oliver. Valerie's life was a spreadsheet of past due notices and carefully rationed groceries. So when a thick, cream-colored envelope arrived via certified mail, bearing the gold-embossed seal of Gable Finch and Montgomery, one of Boston's most elite law firms, Valerie assumed it was another collection agency using scare tactics. Instead, it was a summons. Her great-aunt, Josephine Carmichael, had passed away at the age of 92, and Valerie was required to attend the reading of the will. Josephine had been the terrifying matriarch of the Carmichael family, a woman who built a formidable real estate empire in the 1970s and ruled her descendants with an iron, unforgiving fist. Valerie hadn't spoken to her in a decade. When Valerie had married Derek, a man Josephine accurately predicted was a parasite in a cheap suit, her great-aunt had cut her off entirely. Valerie almost threw the summons in the trash. She couldn't afford to take a Tuesday off work, let alone buy a train ticket to Boston. But her best friend Nancy insisted offering to watch Oliver and lending Valerie a sensible navy blazer. "Go," Nancy had urged. "Even if the old bat just left you a set of antique spoons, you can pawn them and pay off the electric bill." 2 days later, Valerie sat in the stifling wood-paneled conference room of Harrison Gable, senior partner at the firm. The room smelled of old money-leather polish and the cloying, expensive perfume of her cousin Penelope. Penelope sat across the table, draped in a $3,000 Chanel suit, casually inspecting her fresh manicure. Next to her was Valerie's uncle, Leonard Carmichael, a red-faced man who had spent his entire life squandering his mother's money on failed golf course developments. They both looked at Valerie with barely concealed disgust. She was the poor relation, the cautionary tale, her scuffed, sensible shoes completely out of place on the Persian rug. "Shall we get this over with?" Leonard barked, adjusting his Rolex. "Some of us have flights to catch." Harrison Gable, a tall, austere man with wire-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat and adjusted the heavy, wax-sealed document on his desk. "We are here for the estate of Josephine Margaret Carmichael. The total liquidated assets and public holdings amount to approximately $84 million. Penelope let out a soft, triumphant gasp. Leonard leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with sheer greed. Valerie simply stared at her hands. $84 million. She couldn't even conceptualize that kind of money. She just needed $2,000 to fix her car's transmission. Gable began to read the dense legalese. It took nearly 40 minutes to divide the empire. Leonard was awarded the bulk of the stock portfolio and a penthouse in Manhattan totaling roughly $40 million. Penelope received $15 million in cash trusts and the Carmichael family compound in Martha's Vineyard. Various other cousins and charities received millions more. Finally, Gable flipped to the last page. The room fell utterly silent. Penelope smirked, clearly waiting for the punchline. "And to my great-niece, Valerie Simmons," Gable read his voice, faltering slightly, "who so stubbornly claimed she needed nothing from this family when she threw her life away, I leave the sum of $1. May it remind her of the value of the choices she has made." Penelope barked a laugh, quickly covering her mouth with a manicured hand. "Oh my God," $1. Leonard shook his head, looking almost disappointed that the punishment wasn't worse. Well, what did she expect? She dragged the Carmichael name through the mud with that deadbeat husband. Valerie felt the blood drain from her face. The humiliation was sudden, sharp, and suffocating. It wasn't about the money. She had expected nothing. It was the profound, calculated cruelty of dragging her all the way to Boston, forcing her to miss a shift she desperately needed, just to deliver a final, posthumous slap in the face in front of the relatives who despised her. Harrison Gable reached into a drawer, produced a single crisp $1 bill, and slid it across the immense mahogany table. It stopped perfectly in front of Valerie. For a long moment, nobody moved. The silence in the room was thick, suffocating, pregnant with the expectation of a breakdown. Penelope watched with gleaming eyes, waiting for the tears. Leonard looked impatiently at the door. Instead, Valerie looked at the dollar bill, then up at the smug faces of her family. A strange, bubbling sensation rose in her chest. She picked up the dollar, folded it neatly, and slipped it into her pocket. And then she laughed. It wasn't a hysterical laugh or a sob disguised as a chuckle. It was a genuine, bitter, defiant laugh that echoed off the high ceilings. "You know what?" Valerie said, standing up and smoothing her borrowed blazer. "She was right. I don't need her money. I survived Derek. I survived the bankruptcy, and I survive every single day without a dime from the Carmichaels. Enjoy the millions, Leonard. Try not to blow it on another bankrupt golf resort. Penelope, buy some class. Have a great life." She turned on her heel and marched out of the conference room, ignoring the indignant splutters of her uncle. She kept her head high as she walked down the plush corridor, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pressed the elevator button, praying the doors would open before the tears finally fell. "Mrs. Simmons, wait." Valerie turned to see Harrison Gable practically sprinting down the hallway, his usual austere composure entirely shattered. He was clutching a thick, scuffed leather briefcase. "Leave me alone, Mr. Gable," Valerie said, her voice shaking. "I took the dollar. The show's over." "No." Gable panted, catching the elevator door just as it began to slide shut. "The show hasn't even started. Please, come with me to my private office. You didn't let me finish the reading." Valerie frowned, her defensive walls instantly going up. There's nothing left to read. She made her point. The dollar was a diversion, Valerie. Gable whispered, glancing over his shoulder to ensure Leonard and Penelope hadn't followed. "A legal necessity. A test. And you passed. Now please follow me. Your aunt left strict instructions, and we have a very small window of time." Valerie sat on the edge of a leather Chesterfield sofa in Harrison Gable's private, soundproofed office, her pulse racing. The lawyer locked the heavy oak door behind them, drew the blinds, and set his scuffed briefcase on the coffee table. With a soft click, he opened the brass latches and pulled out a heavy manila envelope, a tarnished skeleton key of formidable size, and a weathered leather-bound journal. Josephine Carmichael was a brilliant, vindictive, and deeply paranoid woman. Gable began pacing the room. She knew that the moment she died, Leonard and Penelope would liquidate her legacy. They care only for cash. They have no respect for history, no respect for the bloodline. "I don't understand," Valerie said, staring at the heavy key. "She hated me." "She was disappointed in you," Gable corrected gently. "But she respected your resilience. When your husband bankrupted you, you didn't come crawling back to her for a handout. You went to work. Josephine watched you from afar. She hired private investigators to track your progress." Valerie felt a cold shiver run down her spine. "She was having me followed." "She was vetting you." Gable pushed the manila envelope across the table. "Open it." With trembling hands, Valerie unclasped the envelope and slid out the documents. They were property deeds, tax records, and a certificate of incorporation for an entity called Vanguard Holdings, LLC. In 1982, Gable explained his voice, dropping to a conspiratorial hush. Josephine purchased an estate in the Hudson Valley, near Rhinebeck, New York. It is a sprawling off-the-grid property situated on 200 acres of dense private forest. The house itself is a 40-room Gilded Age mansion known as the Rosemont Estate. Valerie's jaw dropped. 40 rooms Aunt Josephine lived in a penthouse in Beacon Hill. Nobody in the family ever mentioned a mansion in New York. Because nobody knew, Gable said, a faint smile playing on his lips. She bought it under the LLC. She paid cash. For 40 years, she secretly poured her true wealth into that property. The $80 million she left to your uncle and cousin, that was merely her public liquid assets. The scraps, frankly. Gable pointed to the tarnished brass key. The will stated that whoever took the $1 insult with dignity without threatening a lawsuit or begging for a handout would inherit Vanguard Holdings, LLC, and by extension, the Rosemont Estate. By accepting the dollar and walking away, you triggered the addendum. Valerie, the mansion is yours. Fully paid off with property taxes, covered by a blind trust for the next 25 years. Valerie couldn't breathe. The walls of the office seemed to spin. A 40-room mansion, 200 acres. Yesterday she was rationing peanut butter, and today she was the sole owner of a hidden estate. There is a catch, Gable added, his tone suddenly turning grave. Valerie snapped her head up. Of course there is. Your aunt was eccentric. The deed is yours, yes. But the Rosemont Estate is not just a house. It is a vault. Gable tapped the leather-bound journal. Before her death, Josephine liquidated an additional $50 million in untraceable assets, gold bullion-bearer bonds, rare antiquities. She hid them entirely within the walls and grounds of the mansion. She believed that wealth should be earned, not merely handed over. She hid $50 million in a house. Valerie whispered, her mind reeling. Yes, and she left you this journal as a guide. But you must listen to me carefully, Valerie. Gable leaned in his eyes wide with urgency. Leonard is greedy, but he is not stupid. Eventually his accountants will notice discrepancies in Josephine's past financial records. They will start looking for the missing $50 million. You must go to Rosemont immediately. Secure the property. Find the assets. Because once Leonard figures out what you really inherited, he will tie you up in litigation for decades, or worse. 2 hours later, Valerie was on a northbound Amtrak train out of Boston, the heavy brass key burning a hole in her coat pocket. She had called Nancy, begging her to watch Oliver for one more night, claiming there was a legal complication she had to sort out. She rented a cheap sedan in Poughkeepsie and drove into the darkening landscape of the Hudson Valley. As the GPS led her further away from civilization, the paved roads turned to gravel, winding deep into an ancient towering forest. The cell service dropped to 0. The isolation was absolute. Finally, the headlights caught a pair of massive rusted iron gates adorned with the letter R. The gates were chained, but the lock was old. Valerie stepped out into the freezing night air, her breath pluming in front of her. She used the heavy brass key on the padlock. With a satisfying metallic clunk, it gave way. She pushed the gates open, the iron shrieking in protest, and drove the car up a winding, overgrown driveway that seemed to go on for miles. Then the trees parted. Valerie slammed on the brakes, her heart leaping into her throat. Looming in the moonlight was the Rosemont Estate. It was a breathtaking, terrifying monolith of dark stone Gothic spires, and seemingly endless rows of black windows. Ivy choked the lower levels, pulling the mansion back into the earth. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress holding its breath. Taking a flashlight from the rental car's glove box, Valerie approached the massive double oak doors. She fit the skeleton key into the heavy lock. It turned with a heavy, grinding groan. She pushed the doors open, stepping into a cavernous grand foyer. The air smelled of dust, old wood, and something faintly metallic. The beam of her flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating a sweeping mahogany double staircase, marble floors, covered in years of grime, and massive chandeliers draped in cobwebs. Sheet-covered furniture stood like ghosts in the shadows. It was utterly silent. Valerie walked into what looked like a grand library. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls. Above a massive stone fireplace hung a life-sized oil portrait of Josephine Carmichael, in her youth, her eyes sharp and judgmental, seeming to follow Valerie across the room. Resting on the mantel directly beneath the portrait was a single white envelope, with Valerie's name written in elegant spidery cursive. She tore it open. Valerie, if you are reading this, the house is yours. You survived Derek and you survived my test. But your greatest trial begins now. The 50 million is here, scattered in the dark. Use the journal. Trust no one. The house has secrets, and not all of them are monetary. Be fast, my girl. Because he is already looking for you. Valerie froze. He is already looking for you. Did she mean Leonard? Or someone else? Suddenly a sound shattered the dead silence of the mansion. It wasn't the wind. It was the distinct, heavy crunch of tires on gravel outside. Valerie killed her flashlight instantly, plunging the library into total darkness. She crept toward the massive bay windows, peering through a crack in the heavy velvet drapes. Down at the bottom of the overgrown driveway, a sleek black SUV had just pulled up to the front steps. The engine cut off. The headlights died. 4 men stepped out into the moonlight, and Valerie recognized the silhouette of the man leading them. It was Derek, her ex-husband, and he was holding a crowbar. Valerie pressed her back against the cold, velvet-draped wall of the library. Panic, sharp and metallic, tasted like blood in the back of her throat. It was Derek, the man who had walked out on her and their son, Oliver, 3 years ago without a backward glance. The man who had forged her signature on loans and left her to face the bankruptcy courts entirely alone. Now he was here, standing in the overgrown driveway of a secret estate he had no right to know about. How did he find her? The answer materialized almost instantly in her mind. Leonard. Her greedy, spiteful uncle must have realized that Harrison Gable hadn't just handed over a single dollar bill. Leonard's private investigators probably tracked her rental car, and instead of risking his own neck, Leonard had hired the one person desperate and morally bankrupt enough to do his dirty work. Derek. Valerie. Derek's voice echoed through the cavernous foyer as the heavy front doors were violently kicked open. The sound of splintering wood cracked like a gunshot in the silent house. Come on out, babe. We know you're in here. Leonard just wants to talk. He says you have a little journal that belongs to the family. Spread out, another voice grunted. It was a rough, gravelly tone that belonged to one of the 3 men flanking Derek. Check the downstairs rooms first. Watch out for the rot. And find the breaker box. I want lights. Valerie clutched her aunt's leather-bound journal to her chest, her knuckles turning white. She could not let them find her. More importantly, she could not let them find the journal. If Derek got his hands on the $50 million hidden within the walls of Rosemont, he would disappear forever, and Leonard would strip her of the only thing that could guarantee Oliver's future. She needed a plan. She sank to her knees behind a massive mahogany desk and cracked open the leather journal. She clicked her flashlight on, shielding the beam with her palm so only a sliver of weak light illuminated the yellowed pages. Josephine's spidery handwriting filled the paper. "The house breathes, Valerie. It has veins and arteries that the masters never see." The servants knew the truth. "Look behind the painted hounds in the reading room. Push the master's eye." Valerie looked up. The reading room. That was where she was currently hiding. She scanned the dark panelled walls, her eyes frantically adjusting to the gloom. Above the grand stone fireplace, directly beneath Josephine's imposing portrait, was an intricately carved wooden mantel featuring a hunting scene. A pack of hounds chasing a stag. Footsteps thudded heavily on the marble floor of the hallway, growing louder. They were approaching the library doors. "Check in there," Derek commanded, his voice dripping with false bravado. "She's terrified of the dark, probably crying in a corner." Valerie gritted her teeth. She wasn't the same terrified woman he had abandoned. She scrambled silently across the Persian rug, reaching the fireplace, just as the brass handle of the library door began to slowly turn. She ran her trembling fingers over the carved wooden hounds. "Push the master's eye." There was a huntsman carved into the far right edge of the mantel. She pressed her thumb hard against the tiny, polished eye of the wooden figure. With a soft, pneumatic hiss, an entire section of the bookshelf to the left of the fireplace popped outward. It was a hidden servants' passage designed to allow maids to move through the house unseen. Valerie slipped into the narrow, dusty corridor and pulled the bookshelf shut just as the library door swung violently open. "Valerie O'Bars." Derek's flashlight beam swept across the room, filtering through the tiny cracks in the secret door. "Nothing in here, just a bunch of dusty books. Move to the dining room." In the pitch-black passage, Valerie let out a shaky breath. She clicked her flashlight back on. The corridor was narrow, smelling heavily of mildew and ancient cedar. She consulted the journal again. The next page revealed a hand-drawn map of the estate's hidden networks and the first clue to the fortune. "The wealth of fools is kept in banks. True security requires roots. Go to the conservatory. Look beneath the dying exotic palms." Valerie navigated the dark, claustrophobic tunnels, brushing past decades of spiderwebs. She moved with quiet determination. She was playing a high-stakes game of cat and mouse, but this was her house now. She had the map. She reached a wooden panel that, according to the journal, opened into the conservatory. She unlatched it and stepped out into a massive glass-domed room. Moonlight poured through the dirty glass panes, illuminating a jungle of overgrown, dead, exotic plants. In the center of the room sat 4 massive terracotta planters holding the skeletal remains of huge palm trees. She rushed to the largest planter. Using a rusted trowel she found on a potting bench, she dug frantically into the dry, hardened soil. 2 feet down, the trowel struck something hard and metallic. She pulled out a heavy, waterproofed steel lockbox. She smashed the rusty padlock with the heavy handle of the trowel. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas, were neat, thick stacks of paper. She pulled one out and held it up to the moonlight. They were bearer bonds. Untraceable, fully negotiable corporate bonds. She thumbed through the first stack. It was easily worth $5 million. "Well, well, well," a voice sneered from the shadows. Valerie spun around. Derek stood in the arched doorway of the conservatory, a smug grin plastered across his face. He held a heavy steel crowbar in his right hand. His men fanned out behind him, blocking the only exit. "I knew you were always a resourceful girl, Val." Derek chuckled, his eyes locking greedily onto the steel box. "Leonard told me the old bat hid a fortune, but I didn't believe him until now. Hand over the box and the book. Do it, and maybe I won't tell the boys to get rough." Valerie clutched the steel box to her chest. Her mind raced. She was trapped in the glass room, completely outnumbered. Derek took a slow, menacing step forward, tapping the crowbar against his palm. "You don't want to do this, Derek," Valerie said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Leonard will double-cross you. You know he will. He's using you as a pawn. The moment you hand this over, he'll leave you out to dry." "Maybe," Derek sneered, stepping closer. "But I'm looking at $5 million in your hands right now. I don't need Leonard for that. I can take it from you, disappear to South America, and live like a king. Now give me the journal. Where is the rest of it?" Valerie looked at her ex-husband. She saw the greed, the desperation, and the pathetic weakness she had once mistaken for ambition. An idea sparked in her mind, a dangerous, reckless gamble, relying entirely on Derek's overwhelming greed. "You want the rest of it?" Valerie asked, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. She deliberately let her shoulders slump, feigning defeat. "Fine, you win. It's in the basement, the main vault. The bonds are just the petty cash, Derek. The gold bullion is downstairs." Derek's eyes widened. The three thugs behind him murmured excitedly. "Show me," Derek commanded, stepping aside and gesturing with the crowbar. "Lead the way. No tricks." Valerie nodded slowly. She walked past them, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She led the four men out of the conservatory, down a grand hallway, and toward a heavy iron door that led to the subterranean levels. As they descended the steep, spiraling stone staircase, the air grew frigid. Valerie kept her hand tightly gripped around the journal in her pocket. She remembered the blueprints she had studied in the servants' passage. The basement didn't hold a gold vault. It held a Cold War-era fallout shelter that Josephine had repurposed as a high-security, climate-controlled storage room for her furs and perishable antiquities. The door was solid steel, operated by a heavy exterior mechanical locking wheel. They reached the bottom of the stairs. The basement was a labyrinth of brick arches and wine racks. Valerie led them confidently past the empty wine cellar toward the back of the foundation. "There!" Valerie pointed to a massive, reinforced steel door set into the concrete wall. "That's it. Josephine's primary vault. The gold is inside, but the door is heavy. It's going to take all of you to pull the locking wheel and push it open." Derek stepped up to the door, shining his flashlight over the imposing steel surface. His greed completely blinded his judgment. "Get over here," he barked at his men. "Help me turn this wheel." The three thugs crowded around the door, grabbing the massive steel spokes. Valerie took a slow, silent step backward into the shadows. "On three!" Derek yelled. "1, 2, 3!" The men strained their muscles, bulging as the heavy locking mechanism groaned in protest. With a loud metallic clank, the bolts slid back. The heavy door swung inward, revealing a pitch-black, cavernous room. "Where's the gold?" Derek demanded, rushing into the dark space, sweeping his flashlight frantically. The three men followed him inside, completely consumed by the promise of millions. "I don't see anything. Where are the light switches?" Valerie didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, grabbed the heavy iron handle on the outside of the door, and threw all her body weight into slamming it shut. The heavy steel door slammed with an earth-shattering boom, echoing through the basement. Before they could even react, Valerie spun the exterior locking wheel violently to the right. The heavy internal deadbolts slammed perfectly into place. "Hey!" Derek's muffled scream vibrated through the thick steel. Fists began pounding frantically from the inside. "Valerie, open this door. Open it right now." Valerie leaned against the cold steel, gasping for air. A triumphant, breathless laugh escaped her lips. "Enjoy the vault, Derek. It's climate-controlled. You'll be comfortable until the police arrive." She turned her back on the pounding door and walked up the spiral staircase. When she reached the grand foyer, the front driveway was illuminated by flashing red and blue lights. 4 state police cruisers had surrounded the property. Standing on the front steps, flanked by armed officers, was Harrison Gable. He looked relieved as Valerie emerged from the darkness. "Mr. Gable," Valerie said, offering a tired smile. "I took the liberty of placing a GPS tracker in your rental car, Mrs. Simmons," the lawyer confessed, adjusting his glasses. "I knew Leonard would hire professionals to follow you. I just didn't expect him to hire your ex-husband. Are you unharmed?" "I'm perfectly fine," Valerie said, pulling the box of bearer bonds from under her arm and holding up the leather journal. "And Derek is securely locked in the basement storage unit. He's ready for transport." Over the next few weeks, the fallout was spectacular. Derek and his men were charged with breaking and entering attempted assault and extortion. Derek quickly cut a plea deal happily, throwing Leonard under the bus. The police raided Leonard's penthouse, discovering a paper trail that proved he had orchestrated the entire break-in. Leonard was indicted for conspiracy and fraud, his remaining assets frozen by the federal government. Penelope, terrified of being implicated, fled to Europe, completely abandoning her share of the family business. With Harrison Gable's meticulous legal guidance, Valerie fully secured Vanguard Holdings, LLC. She spent the next 3 months carefully extracting the remaining $45 million in hidden assets from the walls, floors, and grounds of the Rosemont estate. She didn't sell the mansion. Instead, she painstakingly restored it, transforming the sprawling 200-acre property into a magnificent private retreat for her and Oliver. She paid off her debts, established a massive trust fund for her son's education, and never worked a double shift at a diner again. One brisk autumn afternoon, Valerie stood on the grand balcony of the Rosemont estate, holding a steaming cup of coffee. She watched 8-year-old Oliver run across the manicured lawns, his laughter echoing through the trees. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, neatly framed object. It was the single crisp $1 bill Harrison Gable had slid across the table. She smiled, tracing the edge of the frame. Her great-aunt had meant it as an insult, a cruel joke designed to humiliate a woman she believed was broken. Instead, that single dollar had bought Valerie her freedom, her vengeance, and an empire. She had won the ultimate game, and she had done it entirely on her own terms. Did Valerie's incredible journey from a single dollar to a $50 million empire leave you completely breathless? Family betrayals, hidden mansions, and the ultimate revenge against a toxic ex-husband prove that sometimes the greatest treasures are claimed by those who refuse to break. If you loved this thrilling, true-to-life story of resilience and hidden wealth, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more jaw-dropping stories. What would you do today, right now?